So I want to turn back to each of our speakers because I know when we cover so much information in these presentations in such a limited amount of time, there might be just one key thought, one key nugget or takeaway you'd like to leave our attendees with today as they absorb some of the materials that we've covered. And if you could just share any final closing remarks you might have. Ben, since you started, could you share yours with us first?
Sure. Thanks again to the Knowledge Group and Tom. Your presentation was great, and for all the attendees for attending today. It's been my pleasure to talk to you. I think the biggest takeaway is that the TCPA landscape is rapidly changing and constantly changing. So, make sure you've got good partners, whether that be legal or compliance. And for any of you working with vendors, make sure that they have the same policy and procedures in place as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again to Ben Carnahan. And Tom, any final remarks?
Yeah, and in part echoing Ben. So if I were pressed for time as I am to give a compliance tip or parting words, we've talked a lot about splits, splits of authority, splits of analyses. And those things that remain after Facebook as to what will constitute an ATDS and where new litigation may arise, where the focus may turn. We talked about the same thing with consent, really revocation of consent, not consent itself, and there being a split of authority regarding that. And when Ben says, make sure that your vendors are also compliant, vicarious liability is an avenue of liability. It's really not a defense. So if I had a parting word, it would be that the best medicine, so to speak, is having the appropriate consent and keeping a record of it yourself, because it's not enough to rely on the third-party vendor. Every company that engages in telemarketing has its own FTC rule compliance that it needs to follow. And accepting verbal requests of revocation, I wouldn't necessarily count on what's going on in one district or another. That should be recorded just as a matter of compliance and best practices, recorded and incorporated on an IDNC list. And where you're appropriately recording yourself, consents or lack of consent, it's really hard to take issue with what you're doing.